In Chapter 12, we're going to deal with species, defining a species, and then talk briefly about races. So on the introductory slide here, we have a picture of a real liger, made famous by the Napoleon Dynamite movie. This actually is a liger, a cross between a tiger and a lion. And so interestingly, this has much to do with our discussion of species. Can two different species reproduce and produce an offspring? And if so, if they produce offspring, is that offspring viable? How do we define a species? That's what we want to spend a little bit of time talking about during our discussion of Chapter 12. First off, the basics of species names. Scientific names for a species have two parts. The first part is referred to as a genus name, and the second part is referred to as the specific epithet. And so the genus name is always capitalized, and the species name is always in lowercase letters. And these two names together are always either italicized or underlined. In reality, in today's world, these names are almost always italicized, unless you happen to be writing and unable to use the italics function. So these names are what we refer to as binomial. They have two parts. The entire name of the species consists of a genus name first and a species name second. So we have an example on this slide of two organisms that are of the same genus but different species. We have a lion on the left, Panthera leo, and we have a leopard on the right, Panthera pardus. And so these two animals share a genus, but as you can see, they are different species. So what is a species, and how do we define a species? The most simple way of defining a species is what we refer to as the biological species concept. The biological species concept states that two organisms, if they are of different species, cannot reproduce and form viable offspring as a result of that reproduction. So this would mean that a horse and a donkey would indeed be different species according to this definition, because when they produce a mule, as we see on the bottom of our slide. Now, mules are living organisms, and there's nothing wrong with them aside from the fact that they are sterile. They cannot reproduce. So we want to talk a little bit about this definition of a species and why organisms may be isolated reproductively. So as we begin our discussion, then, we want to talk about gene flow. What limits gene flow? So if two populations of organisms are reproducing with each other, then you have gene flow. You have genes that go from one to another. However, gene flow does not occur between different species due to what we refer to as reproductive barriers. We generally recognize two types of reproductive barriers. One we call a pre-fertilization reproductive barrier, and one we refer to as a post-fertilization reproductive barrier. We want to talk first about pre-fertilization reproductive barriers. We have 5 types of pre-fertilization reproductive barriers: spatial isolation, behavioral isolation, mechanical isolation, temporal isolation, and finally gamete incompatibility. Over the next couple slides, we'll provide an example of each of these types of isolation. First type of isolation is a type of pre-fertilization isolation, but it's just simply spatial reproductive isolation. And so oftentimes organisms in the environment don't reproduce because they simply are separated by space. And so a very simple example will be our polar bear, which lives in the Arctic, and our black bear, which lives in North America. They never come in contact with each other in the wild, so they don't reproduce because they don't live in the same location. Now, does this necessarily follow exactly and match up exactly with our biological species concept? The answer is no, because if these two organisms were put together, could they reproduce? Well, we don't know. But oftentimes organisms in nature are isolated spatially and therefore don't reproduce because of that. Oftentimes what we see is that organisms that do occur in the same location are isolated because of behavioral reproductive isolation. So on the screen we see one of the most famous examples of that. We see the blue-footed booby. So interestingly, we have our male located on the left who's trying to impress the female on the right. He goes through an elaborate dance and then ending with what's called a pointing display. And the female looks at his behavior and says, okay, I recognize that, and that'll work for me. I'll reproduce here. And so birds are a very common example of reproductive isolation. If they're not dancing as the blue-footed booby is, then the calls of birds serve as a mechanism of reproductive isolation. If a bird doesn't recognize another bird's call, then it's not going to reproduce with that bird. Humans are not totally divorced from this idea of behavioral reproductive isolation. One of my favorite examples that would seem to illustrate behavioral reproductive isolation would be the individuals we see on the screen. So we have Billy Ray Cyrus and we have Hillary Clinton. And so both are approximately the same age. Back when they were of reproductive age, they probably could have met, but I think it's unlikely that because of behavioral reproductive isolation, it's likely that that would have worked out. Alright, so the third mechanism of reproductive isolation that we have is mechanical reproductive isolation. So we very simply have sexual organs that don't fit, that are incompatible. Oftentimes in the insect world we have these genitals that are relatively complex, and so the genital of one species won't match with the genital region of another species. In the mammal world we have the possum. So fascinatingly, what we're looking at in the screen here is the penis of a possum. Possums have a double-pronged penis, and of course the female has a double-pronged vagina, and so this is not seen in raccoons or skunks or other animals that are of approximately the same size. And so of course they are certainly reproductively isolated simply because of the shape of their genitals. They can't reproduce with other organisms that they might otherwise be able to reproduce with. Oftentimes organisms are isolated reproductively because of the time of the year at which they reproduce. So on the screen, on the left-hand side of the screen, we have a rainbow trout. On the right-hand side of the screen, we have brook trout. These are two species of cold water fish. They're often found together in the same streams, but they rarely hybridize. They rarely reproduce with one another because rainbow trout spawn, in other words, they reproduce in the spring. Brook trout spawn or reproduce in the fall. So because they're reproducing at different times of year, it's unlikely that they would reproduce with one another. Finally, we'll mention the last pre-zygotic mechanism of reproductive isolation, which is gamete incompatibility. And so here we have an example where the gametes come together, but they're so different that they don't fuse and produce that embryo. So as an example, we have mussels, freshwater mussels. We have what I believe to be a pink heel splitter shown on the left on the bottom of our screen, and on the right we have what I believe to be a maple leaf mussel. These are both mussels that are found here in central Kentucky. They get fairly large. They're basically freshwater clams, about the size of your hand or so. And when they reproduce, they just spew their gametes out into the environment. The female then is sitting there filter feeding, and she pulls the male sperm into her shell, and she fuses that sperm with her eggs, but only the eggs of her same species will be able to fuse with that. The sperm will be able to fuse with the egg and produce a viable offspring. So she pulls in all the other sperm and treats it the same way, but only the sperm from her species will produce an actual offspring. We also have a couple post-fertilization barriers to reproduction, and these include hybrid inviability and hybrid sterility. So keep in mind here we have two organisms of different species that come together, they form an offspring, but then something happens and that offspring cannot reproduce. So first off, we have hybrid inviability. This means that two organisms from two different species come together, let's say a sheep and a goat, come together and they reproduce. Well, fertilization can occur. A single-celled embryo called a zygote is produced, but that zygote dies very early in development. It doesn't go on and form a full-term offspring that can be born. So interestingly, hybrid inviability then means that most oftentimes, at least, that hybrid is not going to even go to full term and be born. You can produce a hybrid, but it's not very strong and it does not survive. Now on the other hand, interestingly, you can also have a post-fertilization mechanism of reproductive isolation referred to as hybrid infertility. So we're very familiar with this. So we have a horse shown in our diagram here, and we have a donkey. A horse and a donkey reproduce to form a mule. Interestingly, the horse has 64 chromosomes, the donkey has 62 chromosomes, and so the mule has 63 chromosomes. If you think back to our discussion of meiosis in this class, you realize that at meiosis all the chromosomes have to line up in pairs in order to produce viable gametes. In other words, eggs and sperm that can go out and make offspring. The mule has an odd chromosome. It has all the pairs line up, except all the chromosomes arrange themselves into pairs except for one oddball that doesn't have a partner. And this prevents the mule from producing eggs or sperm that are actually viable. So interestingly, in this case, we have an example of an organism, or two different species that produce a hybrid that is very viable. It does live, but it's not able to produce offspring. It is sterile.